Montana Territory, summer of 1876, the day the church bells rang for nothing but gossip. Frances Alden stood tall in the dust, her chin lifted beneath the sting of whispers. "She is not fit," hissed one woman behind her gloved hand. "A wife with no child is a broken promise." Frances kept her back straight and walked past them, each step firm on the gravel path outside St. Peter's. The sun bore down on the town of Sweet Creek, but it was the weight of their judgment that made her shoulders ache. She had married young, loved hard, and buried that love 4 years later in a fevered haze. After Ezra, her husband, died from pneumonia, the hope of children faded like breath on a winter pane. The doctor in Helena had confirmed it. Her womb, he said softly, would never quicken. Now 30 and widowed, Frances ran the schoolhouse by the river and lived in the same clapboard home her husband built with his own hands. She lived quiet, worked honest, and smiled when it was expected. But some women, especially the ones with full arms and empty hearts, never let her forget what she lacked. That Sunday afternoon, she was walking home with her books pressed to her chest when she heard a sharp cry not of pain, but panic. She turned. 2 children stood near the edge of the woods beyond the last homestead fence. A boy, maybe 7. A girl, younger. Frances dropped her satchel and ran. The boy's clothes were torn. The girl clutched a ragged doll, dirt smudged across her cheeks. They looked like they had not eaten in days. Frances crouched. "Are you hurt?" The boy stepped in front of his sister. "We ain't stealing, we got left." "Left?" Frances reached out slowly, showing her palms. "What is your name?" He hesitated. "Grady," he said at last. "She's Grace. Our ma said she'd come back, but—" Frances's heart cracked open. "You are safe now," she said gently, brushing a leaf from Grace's hair. "You are not alone." She brought them into her home, bathed them, gave them warm food and a clean place to sleep. That night, long after they had drifted off in her spare room, Frances sat by the fire with her hands clasped tight in her lap. The town would talk. They always did. But she would not send those children back to the trees. The next morning, she took them to the sheriff. "Found them near the edge of town," she said. "They were abandoned." Sheriff Callahan scratched his beard. "We get a few like that now and then. Might be weeks till we find their kin if we do at all." "I will take care of them," Frances said before he could suggest the orphanage in Helena. He studied her. "You sure?" "I am," he nodded. "Then I will put it in the log." 2 weeks later, the town had not stopped whispering, but something else started to spread a quiet respect. Frances walked with Grady and Grace to the schoolhouse each morning. She taught them their letters, taught them how to line their boots by the door, how to say grace without rushing. She learned what foods they hated, what made them laugh. The ache of her heart softened into something steady, and then came Holden Thorne. He rode in the same way storms rolled off the mountains, broad-shouldered, dust-covered, and quiet-eyed. He had the kind of presence that made people pause. Word was he had drifted from cattle drives and gun work, now looking to settle down and build something that did not bleed. He came to the schoolhouse looking for work, hat in hand. "I heard you might need help fixing the back fence," he said. Frances looked up from her ledgers. "Who told you that, Grady?" he said, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Said you nearly broke your ankle trying to keep the goats from getting in." She exhaled. "That boy and his stories." "Well," she said, "the fence is falling apart. If you know how to use a hammer, I will pay you fair." "I do not need pay," he said, "just something useful to do." She studied him. He was older than her by a few years, his face weathered but not hard. Something in his eyes told her he had seen sorrow too. "All right," she said, "but I will decide if it is worth paying when you are done." He tipped his hat. "Deal." By the end of the week, the fence stood solid and straight. Grady followed Holden like a shadow, asking questions about horses and ropes and how to whistle through his fingers. Grace stayed near Frances, but warmed to Holden's gentler stories by the fire tales of wild herds and prairie dogs and a dog he once had named Maple. One evening, Holden lingered after supper. Frances poured him coffee and they sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the hills. "You are good with them," she said. "They are good kids," he replied. "Just need someone to see them." She nodded. The silence stretched, easy and warm. "I heard what they say about you," he said after a while. Frances turned her gaze out to the fields. "They say enough." "They are wrong," Holden said simply. She looked at him then, her throat tight. "You do not even know me." "I know what I see." He set his coffee down. "You gave those kids something most folks never do, a place to land. That is more than blood." Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I wanted children, I wanted them more than anything." "I can see that," he said. She blinked fast. "They mocked me, said I was no woman. That I was hollow." He leaned forward, his voice steady. "They do not know what real love looks like." Frances tried to look away, but he caught her gaze. "Then let us raise the lost together," Holden said, "if you will have me." Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "You mean that?" "I would not say it if I didn't." He reached for her hand. She let him take it, and just like that, something in her heart shifted, not the quiet ache she had lived with, but something brave. Something new. The wind blew soft through the porch slats. Inside, the children laughed at something. Frances smiled through her tears. "I would like that," she whispered. Holden squeezed her hand. "Then it is settled?" That night, for the first time in years, Frances did not feel broken. She felt chosen. The first frost touched the grass by early September, silvering the blades beneath the cottonwood trees behind the schoolhouse. Frances stood on the back step, apron damp from the morning's wash, watching Holden chop wood in steady rhythm. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, sawdust clinging to the hairs on his arms. Grady sat nearby, turning a crooked wedge of wood into a pretend horse, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. Grace wandered up, dragging her blanket, and leaned against Frances's leg without a word. Frances set the tin basin down and rested her hand on the child's head. "You're up early," Holden said over his shoulder without pausing his swing. Grace only blinked at him, then looked up at Frances. "He works like a train." Frances gave a quiet laugh. "He does. I ain't never seen a man fix things without yelling." Holden set the axe aside and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Yelling doesn't make the wood split any faster." Grady looked up. "But it makes it more fun." Holden knelt beside the boy. "You think so?" Grady nodded. "My pa used to holler every time he fixed the wagon." Then, quieter, "Mama too." Frances didn't move. Neither did Holden. He said, "Well, maybe some things work better quiet." Grady looked at him a long time, then went back to carving. Later that day, Frances took the children into town. She needed flour and kerosene, and Grady's boots had split along the side. At the mercantile, she kept her head high as she always did. The clerk, Mr. Bramble, barely raised his eyes as he tallied the goods. "With the boots, that'll be $2 even," he said, placing the pair on the counter with indifference. Frances reached into her coin purse, but before she could count out the change, a familiar hand set a folded dollar bill beside hers. "No need," Holden said. She turned. "I didn't ask you to, I know," he said. "But I want to." Grady had already pulled the boots on, stomping a little to test the soles. "They ain't squeaky," he grinned. On the walk home, Frances held the sack of cornmeal closer to her chest. "You ought not to do that again," she said. "I will, though," Holden replied. She stopped walking. "I can provide for them." He stopped too. "I know you can, but I'm not doing it because you can't. I'm doing it because I'm here now." She looked down the road toward the hills. "I never asked for a man to rescue me." "I don't think you need rescuing," he said. "But I do think you've been alone too long." She didn't answer. A breeze stirred the dust, carrying the smell of sun-warmed earth and dry grass. Holden stepped closer, voice gentler. "Let me stand beside you, not in front." Frances lifted her eyes to his, something in her expression softening, though her jaw still held its stubborn set. "I'm not easy to walk beside," she said. "I don't scare easy." They reached the house just as the sun dipped low behind the butte. Frances lit the oil lamp while Grace sorted buttons by color. Holden helped Grady hang a shelf in the lean-to, showing him how to hold the nail steady without pinching his fingers. That night, after the fire died low, Frances stood in the doorway of the children's room. Both slept soundly. Grace curled tight as a kitten. Grady sprawled with arms above his head. She stepped back into the kitchen where Holden sat with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. She crossed the room slowly, then sat beside him at the table. "I never thought I'd share my home again," she said. "You didn't share it, you opened it." Frances looked down at her hands. "I don't know what kind of life you want." "I want one where I come in from the fields and hear children laughing," he said. "Where there's a woman near the stove humming something I don't know the tune to. Where the days are hard but the nights are warm." She looked up. "You think that's us?" "I do." She searched his face, looking for any flicker of false promise. There was nothing but steadiness. "I've been careful with my heart, Holden. I'll be careful with it too." She nodded slowly. Then she reached across the table, and this time it was her hand that found his. He didn't move, didn't speak, just held it quiet and sure. Outside, a coyote called somewhere beyond the cottonwoods. Frances closed her eyes and let herself believe, just for that moment, that maybe the worst of the winter had passed. By mid-October, the cottonwoods behind the house had lost their gold, and the wind carried the bitter edge of snow not yet fallen. The days shortened, and the nights grew long around the hearth. Frances had begun stitching heavier quilts in the evenings, her needle whispering through fabric while Grace dozed with her head in her lap. Holden had taken to sleeping in the loft above the lean-to, though Frances had left the matter unspoken. It was not propriety that kept them apart, not exactly, but something older, unspoken grief, perhaps, or the slow, careful way people built trust after years of weathering alone. One morning, Frances found a note left on the kitchen table, written in Holden's spare hand. He'd ridden east before first light to help old Mr. Evers drive his cattle down from a frozen ridge. Grady was disappointed to miss him, but Frances distracted him with a task: hauling chopped wood from the stack behind the barn to fill the bins by the stove. "Stack it neat," she said, handing him a pair of wool mittens she'd stitched from scraps. "You'll be proud when it's done." Grady glanced toward the woodshed, then back at her. "Will he see it when he gets back?" "He will." The boy squared his shoulders and trudged out, arms full of kindling. That afternoon, as the children napped and porridge simmered on the stove, Frances opened the parcel that had arrived from Helena. It was addressed to her in her father's hand, though she hadn't spoken to him since Ezra's funeral. Inside lay a single item: her mother's old black prayer book, its spine worn, the leather soft at the corners. Wrapped in a note that read only, "Thought you ought to have this now." She had never asked for it. Hadn't expected it, either. She ran her finger along the edge of the pages, then closed it and set it on the mantel. That evening, Holden returned before sunset, coat dusted with frost, hair damp from thawing sleet. Frances met him at the porch with a wool blanket and a tin mug of cider. "You're soaked through," she said, taking his saddlebag. "Sit before you freeze." He lowered himself onto the bench with a soft groan. "Evers's cattle dam near stampeded when we hit the river. Took 2 hours to settle them. You didn't say there'd be river crossings. Didn't know till we got there." He took the cider, hands trembling slightly from the cold. "I'd forgotten how loud hooves get when they panic, like thunder close to the ground." Frances sat beside him. "You frightened?" "Not much, just reminded." She waited, but he didn't say more. They sat in silence, the only sound the wind threading through the bare branches. Later, after the children had eaten and settled under their quilts, Holden lingered by the stove, rubbing warmth back into his hands. Frances stood across from him, drying a tin plate. "I got a letter," she said finally. He looked up. "My father. Haven't heard from him in 2 years." "Good news," she hesitated. "He sent me my mother's prayer book." Holden nodded. "That's something you wanted?" "I don't know," she said. "She used to read it every evening after supper. Back when we still lived in Iowa, before we came west." Maybe he thought you needed reminding. "Of what?" "That you're not alone, even if it's just in memory." She set the plate down. "He never forgave me for not going back. After Ezra died. That wasn't his call to make. I think he saw my staying here as some sort of rebellion, or maybe he just didn't know how to carry your grief with his own." Frances leaned against the counter, her voice quiet. I've tried to make a life, something steady. Something that doesn't vanish when the wind changes. Holden stepped closer, the space between them carrying the weight of everything unsaid. You've done more than that, he said. You've made something worth coming home to. She looked up at him then, really looked at the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his brow softened when he was near her, like his whole body exhaled. Grady asked today if we were married, she said. Holden raised an eyebrow. What did you tell him? I told him we weren't, he nodded slowly. And what would you tell him tomorrow? Frances took a breath. That we could be if that's what you want. He didn't hesitate. It is. She reached for his hand and he took it, warm and solid in hers. I want it slow, she said. Not because I'm unsure, but because it matters. We'll build it like a house, he said. One beam at a time, she smiled, small and sure. Then I'll start laying the foundation. Outside, snow began to fall in quiet flurries that clung to the windows and softened the world. Holden knelt beside the stove to stir the fire higher, and Frances brought out the prayer book, setting it on the table beside the tin lantern. She didn't open it that night, but she left it there, spine facing outward, like a promise not yet spoken but waiting to be honored. And in the hush of that warm room, with the fire crackling and two children dreaming under quilts she made, Frances felt the first true settling of peace in her bones. Not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that grows when something lost finds its place again. The first snow held through November, clinging in layered hush to the slope behind the schoolhouse. Smoke curled from the chimney early most mornings now, Frances rising before dawn to warm the kitchen before the children stirred. She baked cornbread in a cast iron pan and set beans to soak by the hearth. Life had quieted into something steady but not still. There was too much to do for stillness. Holden had begun building a woodshed behind the house, hammering through wind and frost with his coat collar turned up. Grady helped where he could, dragging scrap boards and watching Holden's hands with sharp-eyed hunger. Frances watched too, though she kept her eyes lower, her thoughts folded around something she hadn't spoken aloud yet. On a Thursday afternoon, word came that Reverend Mills had taken ill. Frances heard it from the blacksmith's wife, who leaned across the dry goods counter and whispered it like it was a secret too heavy to carry alone. His lungs, she said. They say he won't see Christmas. Frances carried the news home with the flour and salt, her steps slower than usual. At the gate, she found Grace on the porch, humming tunelessly as she wrapped twine around a pine cone. Did you know, Grace said without looking up, that if you put salt on the steps you won't slip? Frances set the sack down beside her. And who told you that, Mr. Thorne? He said it to Grady, but I heard it too. Frances sat beside her, brushing snow from the hem of her skirt. He's usually right about those things. Grace held out the pine cone. It's for him, for when he finishes the shed. Frances took it gently, surprised by the care in its simple shape. He'll like that. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire had burned low, Frances stepped outside. Holden was still at work, lantern hung from a nail, his shadow long and bent across the snow. You'll ruin your hands in this cold, she said, drawing her shawl tight. He straightened, brushing sawdust from his coat. Almost done with the roof, just wanted it finished before the next storm rolls in. She stepped closer. Reverend Mills is dying. Holden's expression shifted, quiet and measured. He's always been kind to you. He married Ezra and me. She let the words hang there, brittle and uncertain. I always thought if I married again, it would be him who stood between us. Holden looked at her, the lantern light catching in the lines beside his mouth. Do you want to wait? I don't want to wait for anything anymore, she said. He didn't reach for her. He didn't need to. I don't need anything grand, she added, just something honest, something real. I've got a ring, he said, almost shy. Bought it in Bozeman last time I took the wagon in for oats. Didn't know when to give it, wasn't sure if I should. Frances blinked against the sting in her eyes. You fool. Why didn't you? Didn't want to scare you off. Nothing about you scares me. He pulled it from his coat, a simple gold band, dulled by the cold. She took it, held it in her palm like a promise. "We should speak to Mills," she said. "Soon, while he still can." 2 days later, Holden hitched the sleigh and bundled the children in wool. Frances wore her mother's shawl, the one with the deep green fringe, and tucked the prayer book beneath her arm. They rode to the parsonage with breath fogging the air and Grace's mittened hands wrapped around Frances's wrist. Reverend Mills lay propped in his bed, eyes bright despite the hollowness in his cheeks. When Frances explained their wish, he smiled faintly and reached for the Bible on the stand beside him. "It won't be a long service," he said, voice thin but sure, "but it'll be true." They stood in the front room, just the four of them and Mills, the winter lights slanting across the floor. Grady fidgeted, Grace leaned into Frances's skirt, and when Holden took her hand and spoke his vows, Frances felt the weight of all her years lift, not erased, but carried forward into something new. Afterward, Mills pressed the Bible into her hands. "I won't be needing it long," he said. "Seems it ought to stay with someone who'll use it." Frances brought it home and placed it beside her mother's book on the mantel. That night, the children made a nest of blankets on the floor and watched Frances and Holden dance slow to no music at all, just the creak of the boards and the soft rhythm of two people who had found, at last, a place to rest. And when Frances lay beside him that night, his arm warm around her ribs, she whispered into the dark, "I never thought I'd feel whole again." Holden kissed her hair. "You were never anything but—" Outside, the wind moved through the pine in long, low sighs. Inside, there was nothing broken left to mend. The weather held through December, brittle but dry, the kind of cold that turned breath to frost before it left your lips. Holden had repaired the roof over the back room with cedar shingles he'd milled himself, and Frances had lined the windows with wool scraps to keep the drafts from slipping through. The house held warmth better now, not just in the walls but in its rhythm, four people moving around one another as if they'd always belonged in the same space. Grady had taken to drawing pictures of horses on every scrap of paper Frances could spare from the schoolroom. She let him. His curls had grown long enough to brush his collar, and he'd begun asking about the books Holden kept by the bed, dog-eared volumes filled with trail maps and stories of the Black Hills. Frances caught him once trying to read the names aloud, his voice low and careful. "That one says Cheyenne Crossing," Holden told him, crouching beside the boy and tracing the letters with his finger. "It's where I saw the stars so bright I thought they'd fall right out of the sky." Grady didn't answer, but he looked at Holden like he was trying to remember every word. Grace had taken to following Frances through every chore, carrying a rag or a spoon or whatever small task she could manage. Her feet made no sound when she moved, but she'd hum to herself, low and breathy, the same way she had when she first arrived. Frances never asked what the tune was. One morning, as the snow began to fall heavy and fast, Holden came in with a letter from the postman and a peculiar look on his face. Frances wiped her hands on her apron. "What is it?" He held it out. "It's addressed to you." "From Iowa." She stared at the handwriting, the same careful script that had penned the note accompanying her mother's prayer book. She opened it slowly, the paper crackling with cold. Her hands stayed steady as she read. "Well," Holden asked. Frances folded it once, then again. "He wants to come. Your father, he says he's tired of the silence, that he wants to see the children and meet you." Holden leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "You want that? I'm not sure it matters," she said. "He's already bought passage. He'll be here after the thaw." Holden didn't press her. He never did. "Then we'll make space," he said. January passed under thick snow. Frances taught lessons by lamplight while Holden carved a cradle from pine boards he'd saved. He didn't say why at first, just worked in long stretches of quiet until one evening, when Frances found the finished piece by the hearth, sanded smooth and lined with a quilt she didn't remember sewing. She looked at him, confused. He stood slowly, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. "I know the doctor said it once, but things change." Frances stepped closer, her breath caught between hope and disbelief. "You think, I don't know," he said, "but I've seen you lately. You're tired different. You move like there's more of you now." She pressed a hand to her stomach, cautious. "I haven't felt anything." "Not yet," he said, "but I built it anyway, just in case." 3 weeks later, she vomited behind the barn before morning light. She said nothing at first, not until the 4th day, when her hands trembled too hard to hold the school slate. Holden watched her across the table that night, his jaw tight. "You're pale." "I'm late," she said. He didn't speak, just reached across the space and took her hand. His fingers were calloused, warm. "Then we wait." By March, there was no more waiting. The doctor from Three Forks confirmed it plainly, and Frances wept on the porch for an hour after he left. Not because she was afraid, but because she had stopped believing it was possible. Holden wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and said nothing. That night, he lit every oil lamp they owned. When her father arrived in April, he stepped down from the stagecoach with a cane and a rattling cough. Frances met him in the lane, the children waiting behind her. He looked smaller than she remembered, his shoulders hunched and his eyes watery from the wind. "I wasn't sure you'd come out," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd write," she answered. He looked past her to Grady and Grace. "They favor you. They're mine in every way that matters." He nodded once, slowly. "I understand that now." She didn't invite him in right away. They walked to the river first, the ice still breaking in slow, echoing sheets. She told him about Ezra, about the years in between, about Holden and the children and the life she'd built with her own 2 hands. Her father listened. And when she finished, he took her hand and kissed her knuckles like he used to when she was a girl. "I'm proud of you," he said, "even now, especially now." He stayed through the summer, sleeping in the lean-to until Holden built a small room off the back of the house. He taught Grady to sharpen knives and told Grace stories about Frances as a child. When the baby came a girl with dark eyes and a cry like high wind, he held her with trembling arms and whispered her name like a prayer. Miriam. Frances recovered slowly, but Holden never left her side. He fed the livestock, taught the school lessons, and rocked Grace to sleep when her dreams turned rough. On the first warm evening of June, he brought Frances outside and pointed to the row of sunflowers he'd planted near the fence. "For you," he said. "So you never forget what light looks like." She leaned against him, Miriam asleep in her arms, and watched the petals turn toward the setting sun. The years that followed passed in quiet abundance. Grady grew into a tall, serious boy who built a saddle with Holden's help at 13. Grace learned to read with Frances's steady patience and became a teacher herself. Miriam ran barefoot through the summers and cried only when the sun went down. Frances and Holden never left Sweet Creek. They didn't need to. Their world was already full. Every morning began with the sound of children and ended with the hush of firelight and Holden's hand in hers. And not once, in all the years that followed, did Frances forget the cold ache of grief that once lived inside her. But that ache had long since given way to warmth. To love built not from what was lost, but from what was found and held and cherished, and so it stayed. Always.